Okay, so for those who don't know, KeyData is a Canadian leader in IAM, CIAM, and PAM services. Our clients are large enterprises to mid-sized companies in all industry sectors across Canada and the United States. And we're currently running numerous IAM, CIAM, and PAM engagements both in Canada and the US. So what I think sets KeyData apart from others in this space is our rich heritage of governance experience, as well as extensive experience with leading technologies and successful complex enterprise deployments. We're very honored to sponsor this event, and we've really never seen the level of activity in the market around CIAM as we see today. So we anticipate this to continue going forward. And given the COVID-19 pandemic, organizations are looking to engage with their customers digitally and securely. And in this time of uncertainty, gaining and keeping customer trust is a key differentiator. So what we're going to try to look at today are two main topics. The first one I might go through pretty quickly because Padmalatha covered it fantastically in terms of what CIAM is and what it covers, but we'll take a quick look at that. And then secondly, especially for those who are already familiar with the CIAM space, we're going to take a look at an emerging trend, which is allowing secure access to customer data via third-party applications. And if you have any questions specific to the presentation, please post them in the Q&A and I'll do my best to get to them afterwards. So just in terms of review, it's important to level set on the differences between classic enterprise IAM and customer IAM. So enterprise IAM is traditionally driven by compliance in regulated industries, efficiency in terms of user lifecycle management, and of course, security. Another way to look at it is that as an organization, we make the rules that our employees are required to follow, while CIAM is about enabling our customers to have a great user experience that will encourage them to purchase our products and services. And security is increasingly paramount, while compliance with ever-evolving regulatory requirements is expected by our customers. So scale, user experience, and source of identity are also contrasted in the slide for you to see how much bigger CIAM is, how a much greater emphasis is placed on user or customer experience, and how users either create their own identities or bring their own, instead of being sourced from an HR system. Of particular relevance to our discussion today is the last item, privacy and consent. So enterprise IAM is more about controlling access to resources based on, role-based access control, while customer IAM or CIAM requires a different approach. With CIAM, customers must provide their consent for you to use their data. And we'll get into that in much more detail in the second part. So I've just broken down CIAM into 6 main areas. The first one, authentication, one of the main features used by all CIAM solutions. And I think Padmalatha covered this very well, so let me skip over that one. App integration, same thing. This is really, CIAM platforms are usually orchestrating single sign-on and single logout for customers across multiple applications, using modern authentication protocols like OpenID Connect and in some cases SAML. But more and more applications are integrated using OpenID Connect as the de facto industry standard, and that's certainly always our recommendation. I'll skip over the next ones there. I think we covered these as well. So user self-service, customers being able to register their own accounts, edit their profiles, reset their passwords, link their social identities to local identities, as well as providing some sort of identity proofing through email verification or third-party identity proofing integration. So you could argue that without a great user or customer experience, nothing else in these slides matters, because this is really what we're striving towards. And CRM and MarTech integration both lead to customer experience by providing actionable insights and data-driven decision-making, So this is information coming out of the CIAM system, going into those systems to enable marketing campaigns, etc. Call center integration allows our agents to have better information to answer customer questions and to execute account-related tasks on the customer's behalf. And customizing these various user journeys across all channels is one of the most important ways to engage with our customers. So CIAM solutions can be deployed in various ways, and those are typically driven by the particular solution that you purchase. So SaaS, or identity as a service, is increasingly popular, and especially for more cloud-native organizations, while others want their solutions managed as a service by MSPs. And in many cases, solutions are deployed, quote unquote, on premises, which nowadays typically means they're running in a cloud-hosted infrastructure such as Azure, AWS, or the Google Cloud Platform. And finally, privacy and consent is typically focused on the actual identity data that customers share with an organization during registration. And we'll talk more about additional customer data shortly. Progressive profiling is a technique we use to capture only the customer data we need and only when we need it. So customer data download allows our customers to see what an organization has and to be able to bring that down and inspect that, take it, do whatever they need to. Delete me functionality is to end a user's relationship and their digital relationship with an organization. Security assurance certifications. These allow, or they, sorry, I'm having some PowerPoint issues here. We'll just switch to the old paper copy. These are the data storage standards and that vendors need to adhere to. So here we go. Sorry about that. And for how customer data can be stored and transported. And finally, applications connected to the CIAM platform are typically given access to customer identity data implicitly, and customers are typically not prompted for this consent. So instead, what's called administrator level consent is granted to the application and customers never see it. So just kind of high level from a quick reference architecture point of view, just wanted to boil down some of these CIAM features to prepare us for the second part of our talk. So applications are integrated with the CIAM platform, as we talked about, using OpenID Connect for centralized authentication and authorization. After login in OpenID Connect, an identity token that represents the user, an access token that gives access to the user info endpoint, and refresh tokens to get new access tokens when the access token expires are issued to applications. There we go. So the application might make an additional call to the user info endpoint if it needs to get additional user information. But generally, the information in the ID token is enough, and the access token is not heavily used. Applications can call customer data APIs to read and write customer data. And this is data that's outside of the core identity data. So note, API apps will also typically call APIs that are not related to customer identity or customer data, but these are really outside the scope of our discussion. So finally, the way most CIAM systems are implemented, the user context is typically lost once the APIs are called. Okay, so that's an important point that we're going to come back to. Because essentially the access token that was provided by the CIAM authorization server is not the one that gets used by applications typically to call customer APIs. They're using typically something called an API key which is similar to a password that's given to an application for all API calls, or an access token from a separate authorization server that's disconnected from the CIAM authorization server. Okay, so moving on now to customer data sharing. In terms of a requirement, here's how we can try to articulate the potential change in the industry and the need for CIAM innovation. As a customer, I want to securely grant access to a third-party application to consume some of my data and provide me with value-added services. So increasingly, regulators are siding with customers and declaring that customers own their data and should be able to share it with their consent. And in fact, Australia has passed, and as of last year is now enforcing a new consumer data right. Essentially, it gives consumers rights over their data that an organization possesses. Now, this has mainly been influenced by the open banking movement in Australia, but could also apply to any industry that contains customer data that customers want to leverage. And I want to take a minute to acknowledge that this is the scary part. I've had many conversations with many people from all walks of life, and this is scary to them, and I get it. I know there are always going to be people who don't want this, and that's perfectly fine. This is about choice. But if I choose to grant access, how do I know that it's being done safely? And we'll talk about that more. So just in terms of some examples of what kind of customer data we're talking about. So customer purchases and itemized transactions in a retail space shared with third-party loyalty app. Banking, this is really the open banking case where we've got customer account balances, transactions, payments shared with third-party fintech applications. Healthcare could be patient medical care history shared with third-party health providers. Or in the case of insurance, customer claim history, driving record, and policy coverage details. So I'm sure you could come up with additional examples. But since open banking might be a new concept for some people, it certainly was to me not that long ago, I just wanted to dive into that just quickly well, not quickly, there's a little bit to talk about here. So in my mind, open banking is really the coming together of the emerging fintech industry with the API economy. In other words, as you see there, regulated third-party fintech apps that access customer banking data and payment services via APIs with advanced security and user consent. So fintech is the term used to refer to innovations in the financial and technology crossover space. Typically refers to companies or services that use technology to provide financial services to businesses and customers. And the API economy is really allowing organizations to drive additional revenue by offering up their data as APIs. So for example, Uber uses the Google Maps API to provide directions, driver location overlays, etc. McDonald's uses the Uber Eats for food delivery, which uses the Google Maps API. So you can see how APIs are built on top of each other to deliver revenue and value across organizations. This is really the API economy in action. But the issue is that in the banking industry, it has not historically participated in the API economy and doesn't typically offer standard APIs that can be used by the fintech industry. So a bit more specifically, open banking promises to offer standardized banking APIs that can be used by regulated third parties to access your account information and banking payment services. The idea is you never share your bank password again. And this one is a bit personal for me because it's really hard to believe in 2020 as a cybersecurity professional that this is still going on. So instead of sharing your password, the third party would redirect you to log into your bank, and then you would give consent to the regulated third party app to securely access your bank transaction history or make a payment. So current third-party solutions in this space typically store your banking credentials And instead of using well-documented and supported APIs, they're using a combination of screen scraping and there's a clever new way of doing it, of reverse engineering the mobile apps and the APIs calls that they're making in order to integrate with your banking system. So as scary as something like open banking can be, the current situation from a cybersecurity perspective is actually quite a bit scarier. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this slide, but I just want to say that there's a whole international context to this discussion. If you are not familiar with open banking, certainly check it out. There's a lot going on and has been since arguably 2015 or earlier. And I think the message for Canadians, and certainly as we embark on this journey, if we do, which we'll get into in a second, is that there's a lot we can learn from what's been done in the rest of the world. So just from a Canadian context, though, if we look back, February 2018, the Trudeau government announced their intention to study the merits of open banking in the February 2018 budget. In September 2018, the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, launched an advisory committee to study the merits and risks of open banking. In June 2019, the Senate committee recommended the Government of Canada to move ahead with an open banking framework. And they noted that nearly 4 million Canadians were estimated to be using screen scraping applications. And just recently in January 2020, the findings from the first phase of the 2018 study were released. And I believe I have a link here, there you go. Certainly encourage you to read through them because they really are going to shape the future of open banking within Canada. And I think there are a lot of sensible recommendations in there. Pulled out a few of them. So it was recommended to rename open banking in Canada to Consumer Directed Finance, or the CDF, because some people found the name misleading and a bit of a misnomer, that it sounded like this was opening up your banking information in the clear for everyone to access. And that's certainly not the idea or the case. Secondly, the CDF should be consumer controlled and personal privacy rights must be considered. Number three, they also recommended that cybersecurity best practices and standards, as well as privacy and data protection measures, must be core participant protections. Number four, the third party should be accredited. Number five, the GOC should announce a bold, clear, and concrete timeline for delivering the CDF. Number six, that government and industry should work together. Government should be the guardians of oversight and enforcers of protection rights, and industry should drive Canada's CDF technical standards. And last but not least, number seven, the report found that the current unstructured environment poses data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity risks to consumers and financial institutions. And sorry, I should have mentioned here, unfortunately, there is a second phase that was planned, I believe, for May 2020, but it was delayed because of COVID-19. So now that's been pushed to fall of 2020, tentatively. So in other words, the open banking doesn't yet exist in Canada, but based on all the results of the study, and as well as the international momentum that we didn't really go into, but all indications are that open banking or consumer-directed finance is coming to Canada. So now that we've looked at open banking, let's come back to customer data sharing. And remember that this is a generalized pattern, while open banking is a specific example in implementation. So it's my view that customer data sharing sits at the intersection of API management, consent management, and CIAM integration. And I'll try to break these down one at a time. So I know we have a lot of technical people in the audience. That's fantastic. I love that. But for those who have heard about APIs a million times, but are never really sure exactly what they are. I found an example online that I think is pretty helpful. It's essentially like you're going and ordering food at a restaurant. Maybe during these times, it's not the best analogy to use, but anyhow, I think it might help. So the menu that you get at a restaurant provides a list of dishes that you can order, along with a description of each dish. And this is very similar to API documentation. When you place your order with the server, you order what menu items you want. This is actually like an API request. And the server takes your order to the restaurant's kitchen, who makes the food, and then the server provides you with some hopefully delicious food. And this is actually like the API response. So you don't need to know how the restaurant makes food. You just place your order and you get the food. Similarly, you make an API request and you get an API response. Consent management really provides a layer of governance for organizations and allows consumers to be in control of any third-party data sharing that they choose to engage in. And I've probably made up a few words here, but I've labeled these the consentables. So capturable means that consent needs to be captured from the consumer for it to be explicit and binding. Enforceable means that before customer data is accessed, the user consent status needs to be checked. Relatable means that the wording used to describe consent must be meaningful to end users. Auditable means, well, I think we all know what that means, but we need to store it in a way that we can later determine when consent was given or denied, and when it was used for API access to customer data, or when it was blocked. Finally, revocable means that consumers must be able to change their minds and revoke consent at any time. From a regulatory point of view, GDPR consent is one of the easiest of the 6 GDPR legal bases for using customer data to satisfy, provided you clearly explain what you're going to do and obtain explicit permission from the data subject. When that processing is based on consent, the subject has the right to remove it at any time. PIPEDA, which applies to us in Canada, says that meaningful consent is an essential element and that organizations are generally required to obtain meaningful consent for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. So I wanted to flash this up. This is what I would call a more modern consent screen offered by one of our partners here today, Cloud Entity. This provides a clear picture of what is actually being requested. It gives the user clarity and choice about what they want to allow and what they don't. It also gives them a notification about a potential privacy issue for them to consider. And finally, it allows users to specify a validity period for the consent. So if we look at a similar diagram as what we saw earlier, it's been changed a little bit here, but we can see 3 of the main components of existing CIAM systems. So the user info endpoint, the authentication service, and the authorization server. And the main idea behind this conceptual architecture, keep in mind this is conceptual, it's not meant to indicate any kind of product or vendor or deployment. These are just the concepts here, is that we want to add in consent management, customer API management, and we want to enhance our CIAM security perimeter. So now our third-party apps can authenticate using OpenID Connect, similar to before, and our authentication service will use the authorization server to pass it on to the consent management to validate that the customer has provided the necessary consent for the request. So the consent management system verifies the policies that have been configured by the organization to check for what consent is needed And if it doesn't have the necessary consent, it will prompt the user for that consent. Once all that is completed, the third-party app will get back the ID token, the access token, and the refresh token the way it did before. And from there, the application can query the user info endpoint. But most importantly, now the app can make customer API calls with the access token that was issued by the CIAM authorization server. The API management platform can then validate the access token and ensure that the token corresponds to one issued by the authorization server with all consent policies fulfilled. So there are many other factors to consider, but hopefully this helps to illustrate some of the foundational concepts we've discussed today. So if we're going down this road of opening up our systems to allow customers to share their data with third parties, then we need to ensure that customers know exactly what we're doing with their data, we do it securely, and we do it with their permission and consent. We also need to be able to audit all access to customer data and allow customers to change their mind about what they want to share. Ultimately, savvy customers will choose your competitor if your competitor not only shows greater respect for their data, but also allows them to do more with their data. And we can only skim the surface of potential innovation at this point. There are so many opportunities for customers to use and combine data in new and creative ways that the best thing we can do today is to prepare ourselves and our systems to support these future use cases. Extending our CIAM security perimeter to manage customer consent and customer APIs is one important step.